Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome all of us back to the lectures we have been having, or we're about to have. The lecture today centers on an important topic, and which of course serves as the foundation, or what we can call the foundation, or the foundation that is the source of communication, the beginning of it, the beginning of what? Communication. So here we are going to look at the introduction to communication, communication systems, communication models, and networks. So all of these things are going to be discussed in our class today, or in our lectures today. Now, all of us, one way or the other, are involved in communication on daily basis. And if we have to look back, or if you have to go by the holy writs, we'll discover that communication is an ancient act. It's an ancient act, and it is not just an ancient act, it is an ancient act identifiable with God. It's identifiable with God. That is, God was the first person that actually started communicating before all of us picked it up from there. And what we mean is that communication actually started with God. And if you have to go, I said the holy writs, that is, you go by the Quran or by the Holy Spirit, I mean by the Bible, we have all of that there. The beginning, or what we call the creation story, it started with what? God communicating, let there be, and that is what? Communication. And when it happened like that, let there be, what happened? There was a response, and from there communication started. So that's why I said communication is an ancient act. And it is part and parcel of what? It's part and parcel of existence. Now let's go straight to the definition of communication. Definition of communication is the word communication is derived from the Latin word communis. Let's identify the definition of communication from the word what? Demunis, which means what? Common. This means that individuals involved in communication, by this definition, attempt to ensure a common basis for understanding what the message that is communicated between them. What we mean by this is that there must be something to warrant communication. Something must prompt communication. There must be a reason for communicating, or for communication to take place, before we can even think of what? Embarking on the exercise. So it won't just happen like that. There must be a basis for it, and that is what we mean by what? Common basis for understanding the message that is what? Communicated between them. A more authorized definition of communication is that what? Is by the American Society of what? Of Directors, who says that what? A good communication is the interchange of thoughts or information to bring about what? Mutual understanding and confidence, or human relations. Interchange of thoughts or information, something you share between two, or two people share something in common, and it's for what? To bring about mutual understanding, right? It is not one-sided thing. It is more of, it is something that follows the principle of symbiotism. That is, it follows the principle of reciprocity. As you give, so you receive back. Not that you give and it goes that direction and it doesn't come back, or there is no return from that direction to which it has been given. That is not what we are talking about. But we say what? A good communication is the interchange. That is interchange of thought or information. That you exchanging of what thought, information about mutual understanding and confidence or good human relations. If we don't look at it this way, if you just say it has to do with what? It has to do with information and what is it called? Information and thought and the rest of them. And we fail to put there that it has to do with interchange. Definitely, if one even think of something, that means one without even expressing it or without sharing it with another person, that one can interpret that as communication. But it is not so. Communication is not just what it's not what we perceive, it's not what we think of, it's not an idea that is what latent within us, it's not an unexpressed idea, but it has to do with what? An idea that is exchanged. It must have been thought of, it must have been conceptualized, then it must have, after that, then it has to be what? Exchanged, and the exchange has to go between what? Two, before we can think of what or talk of communication taking place. Then you have another authority in communication, is by the name what? Mary Ellen Guffey. And this one defines communication as what? Transmission of information and meaning from one individual to another. That is it. Meaning we have two ends involved in communication, not just one end. We have two ends, and those two ends must have something that establish or something that combines or brings them together, and that is what that the message, right, of communication. Then communication, however, is not limited to the art of what speaking or writing, but also covers body language, personal manners, and the way and styles. These are what exhibited. That's non-verbal what cues. So communication is not just speaking, writing, and listening and giving responses. Not just that. There is an all-encompassing concepts. Yes, including the non-verbal cues. Let me put it that way. The non-verbal cues, that is, the ideas we do not express, but we act. At times we don't talk, but we act. And people say action or actions speak louder than voice. Yes, at times you act, and it can become, one can communicate through what? Through action or actions, right? Or integrated actions. That is what we mean. What we mean by that is it has to do with what? Body language, personal manners, and the way and styles these are exhibited. That is communication. In effect, communication is a two-way. That is, as a result of that, communication is what? Is a two-way process, and it's not complete without feedback. Meaning, it involves a sender and what? And a decoder. It's as simple as that. However, I will have to tell us here that these facts, all the explanation we are giving on communication and these facts, is further established by the what? These facts is further established by the theories of communication models. So what we are simply saying here is that the communication model, that is communication model, what it all entails is source of a message, that is identity of the source of a message, then the identity of the words, the receiver, a two-way thing. It goes from one end to the other end, then comes from the other end back to the what? The first end. These are the things we're talking about here. Now let's look at a different perspective of communication. A different perspective of what? Communication. How do we perceive communication? In the ancient time, at the different times of, how do we perceive communication? That is, perspectives or different ways communication is what is interpreted. How is it seen by some people? How do some other people see it? Right? The various need their viewpoints and or perspective of communication as presented by various writers are: you have modern perspective, you have interpretive perspective, you have critical perspective, and you have postmodern perspective. These are the perspective which we have, or these are the angles by which we can actually explain communication. So what is the modern perspective of communication? Having said something basically on communication, now what is the modern perspective of communication? The modern perspective of communication assumes fundamentally that managers and other superiors engage in workplace communication, for instance, must have some level of control in order that they are able to intervene as at and when necessary. That's the modern perspective. You must have, or you must be in charge. You cannot, if we want communication to actually be effective, especially in an organizational setting, then the encoder or the person who is the source of the message must wield some influence, must have some measures or some levels of control over his or her subordinate, or the people he wants to pass the message across to. Right? So must have some level of control in order that they are able to intervene as and when necessary. This modern perspective of communication has tended to see organization as more complex phenomena that cannot be fully understood using the tools of natural science. That is what we are talking about here now, this modern perspective. So what this one is talking about is that if you are in charge and there is information for people to act on, tendencies are that people like that will listen. People like that will listen because they know from where. They know the person that has given the message across is equally capable. So they will have to think about a lot of things before they refuse, especially in an organization, to do what they want to they want to look at the person. They wouldn't want to do otherwise because they know the person can do and undo. So we said this modern perspective of communication has tended to see organization as as more complex phenomenon that cannot be fully understood using the tools of natural science. Yes, but that is just the modern perspective. You look at it from the angle that whoever is a message giver must be in charge. He must be the boss. He must wield some kind of control. He must just not unnecessarily puffing or not unnecessarily showing off anyway, but then he just must appear to be there so that people can always have someone to fall back on But not just that alone. So, and once you wield that power, people will see, or they will see that this person is worth listening to. Alright? Because there won't be contrary views. That is why it is what? It is modern perspective that we are considering here. The modern perspective here. Right? The interpretive perspective. The interpretive perspective. This perspective tends to be less concerned with generalized theory, but aims at revealing the complexity and richness of communication. How complex, how rich is communication? The concern of this perspective is not to generalize theory. It's not just to generalize, but the concern is what? Communication is rich and communication is complex. It has been established that interpretive perspective has some linkage to the ethnographic tradition in anthology. Of course, we're talking about interpretative perspective of communication. I've said we have talked about the complexity involved and the richness of communication here. We said it has been established that interpretative perspective of communication has some linkage to what ethnographic tradition in anthropology. What's all about that? What is that all about? Rather, we have scientific study of people, culture, and their society. That is, you interpret communication based on these variables, based on these factors. That is, interpret or perhaps give meaning to communication based on what's it called, information. An application of ethnographic study to communication, therefore, will imply that researchers must spend lengthy period in the field of communication using qualitative method like observation, record conversation, stories, and other activities bordering on communication, especially in offices, assembly plant, and informational or informal relationships. Right? That is that. So what we're actually saying here is that the interpretive perspective is too scientific and it's cumbersome to employ in trying to explain or trying to interpret or perhaps trying to express what communication is all about. So, and that's from there we go on to what the critical perspective. The critical perspective. The idea behind the critical perspective is linked with the ways communication channels are used to exercise power over employees in an organization. For example, how do we employ communication channels to exercise power over employees in an organization? We have research information on methods found in the modern interpretive word perspective is also relevant to the critical perspective of communication. The first two stages or the first two perspectives of communication actually provide a cannon fodder, or actually provide a take-off or the foundation for this critical perspective. The critical perspective, however, uses a more skeptical approach, and this means a certain degree of what critique of the manner in which communication evolves. That is, you look at the channels, right? Channels involved in communication. you look at those channels, right, there is a kind of what criticism on those channels. Criticism on those channels. That is, if we have to base communication on these channels alone, then can we say at the end of the day we are going to have something effective, we are going to have something reliable, we are going to have something that is what is it called, eternal, or something that can always stand the test of time? So that is critical perspective is simply talking about or making reference to what, to the channels involved in communication. That those channels are not just what, they are not what matters per se, or they are not the most important element in communication. Those is not, the channels are not the most important element in or aspects of communication. They too matter. They too are of importance, right? They are of importance, but at the same time, what about the encoder? What about the receiver? We can leave out those two and focus on what, on the channel alone. The channel will not make communication, but the channel exists because what, communication is what is needful. That is why we create a vehicle to do what, to communicate. So we have, so it is not what about the channels there? Say the channels, of communication matter, but they are not the ultimate without the message involving the encoder and the decoder. Postmodern perspective of communication. Postmodern perspective of communication. The postmodern perspective, what's it all about? The postmodern perspective challenges the assumptions of the modern perspective. For example, it challenges the assumption of modern perspective of what, of communication. What example there? The way and the manner in which research is used in the evolution of theory of communication science. That is, the theory, that is something to establish communication, in which the research used in establishing the theory of what, of communication, the manner in which it is used, is what this postmodern perspective is criticizing. And what is it talking about really? Say the main focus of the modern perspective is that there is no natural access. There is no neutral access to the world as portrayed by what? By modernists. Neutral. No. Nobody can be neutral in this case. Communication is believed may be influenced by variables such as language, globalization, contemporary trends, the internet, and the rest of them. All these variables affect communication. There is no how we can talk of communication without some or all of these things. So postmodern perspective of communication is not limiting what communication as a concept, limiting it to what it's used to be, or limiting it to what to the ethnographic what idea of communication, or limiting it or leaving that and going to the aspect, the one that talks about what the aspect of channel, that is focusing on the channel instead of what the message and the messenger, right? But this time around, he's talking about what, and it is not just talking about the modern perspective alone, which probably talks about what is the way we go, what is the traditional way we go about what communication. But this time around, he's talking about what, some other variables. And what are these other variables? Here they call it postmodern perspective. The communication may be what, influenced by variables such as language, globalization, contemporary trends such as what, the internet. So all of these things, they have their take on communication. All of these things affect communication one way or the other. Take for example now, language. The general language in the world is what? The general language. Or do we say international language? English language is one of the international languages that we know. But it is not everybody that understands what English, to the extent of using it to communicate. Right? So, if there is arrangement to reach out to a mass of people, or to reach out to people, or to people far and wide, what will happen? This language cannot be used universally, because it's not everybody that understands. It's not everybody that uses it. There is going to be what, noise in the process of what, communication, and this will kind of call for interpretation, that is using local dialects or vernacular to explain or interpret what is being said. And so, if this continues, or if it happens this way, then it's becoming, you discover that what communication there is becoming what, complex. It's becoming cumbersome to handle. Is becoming more than just what, the basic things. So in the modern perspective, we have various what, we have different things that are just what, cropping up and making communication more than what it used to be. And that is why they call it one postmodern perspective of what, there are lots of issues involved in communication nowadays. There are lots of issues involved in communication. And that is true. There are a lot of issues involved in communication. It used to be primary. That is basic before, but nowadays we have a lot of accessories, we have a lot of things to consider, quite a number of things, right? So depending on us, and depending on the message that we want to get across and who we want to get it across to. That postmodern postmodern perspective of communication. Then this time around, we are going to the goals of communication. This is very, very simple. Of course, we know that communication is what is very vital in the process of management, right? It daily occurs in our at workplace and in our daily lives. So, what are the goals of communication? We can identify 4 here. First of all, why do we? What is the aim? What is the target? Why communication? We said to improve what? Recipient levels of what? Understanding of the message communicated. Who is the recipient? The receiver. To elicit receiver's what? Response. Why we communicate is to have a reply. If you communicate and there is no reply, then quite a number of things will start what's happening there. So to elicit what response, to create good relationship. That's what communication does, right? To create good relationship, right? Either in the organization, either at the official level, and as we say, is formal communication, or the informal system, either formally or informally. Formally we mean what organization? Informally we mean probably at the family unit or at individual level with others. So what communication does is what? To create, to open an avenue to reach understanding. To open an avenue to reach understanding. If two people, or if a couple is living together and one is talking and the other one is not talking, then we can imagine the anxiety or perhaps the kind of frustration that will come upon the one talking, because virtually everything he does, he is not receiving a feedback, whether positive or negative, and so he doesn't know if what he does or what he's doing is bad or is good. To create organizational goodwill is communication, the goodwill of all stakeholders that the organization deals with, such as what the clients, the suppliers, the customers, government, the community, is necessary for the continued operation of the business. So we need communication in these four areas. These items or these things mentioned, they actually what? They are things that communication actually get across to people. Alright, those are the things why people communicate.